The unbreakable photograph. The mid-morning sun poured through the high windows of the bustling courthouse, creating a cascade of light that danced across the polished floors. Judge Elias Moreau adjusted his robe in his chambers, his hand steady but his mind unsettled. The day had started like any other, routine hearings, unremarkable disputes, but there was a case on the docket that carried an unfamiliar weight. Something about it tugged at his mind like a loose thread. Elias closed his eyes and took a slow breath, preparing for the day. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as he entered. Lawyers shuffled papers, social workers exchanged quick glances, and a small girl sat on the front bench, her legs dangling, barely brushing the floor. She wore a simple yellow dress, and her braids were adorned with bright blue ribbons that seemed out of place amidst the solemnity of the room. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing off the cavernous walls. The room stood in unison as Judge Moreau took his place on the bench. He scanned the room with a practiced gaze, but his attention lingered on the girl for a moment longer than usual. There was something in her posture, poised, yet weighed down. The court proceedings began with the usual formalities, but Elias's focus wavered as he watched the girl. She sat quietly, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress. She had something tucked into her lap, but he couldn't quite see what it was. The attorneys presented their arguments, their voices carrying an air of detachment that grated against the gravity of the case. "This is a custody matter involving a minor, Miss Maya Benson, age 9. The social worker, Evelyn Grant, began. Her tone was professional, but Elias could see the fatigue in her eyes. "Maya has been in the foster care system for the past 3 years. The current placement is no longer viable due to circumstances beyond the foster parent's control." Elias leaned forward slightly. "And what are the alternatives being considered?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing at the girl. "Your Honor, there are limited options. Maya's extended family has not responded to outreach, and suitable foster families in the area are at capacity." Maya shifted in her seat, and for the first time, Elias noticed the photograph in her hands. She clutched it tightly, her knuckles white against the edges of the faded paper. He made a mental note to address it later. The attorneys continued their arguments, their voices blending into a monotonous hum. Elias's thoughts strayed back to Maya, who hadn't spoken a word since the proceedings began. When the social worker addressed her, she gave brief, polite answers, but offered little insight into her preferences. It was clear she'd been coached to keep her emotions in check. Finally, Elias broke his silence. "Miss Benson," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "would you like to speak to the court? This is about your future, and your thoughts matter." Maya looked up, her large, expressive eyes locking with his. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, she nodded and stood, holding the photograph close to her chest. She took a step toward the judge's bench, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing furniture. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. I think you should know something." The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on her as she unfolded the photograph and held it out. Elias leaned forward, and his breath caught in his throat. The image was old, faded around the edges, but unmistakable. It was a picture of him, much younger, smiling alongside a woman he didn't immediately recognize. Maya's voice quivered as she spoke, her words slicing through the tension. "This is you, and you're my father." The collective gasp that rippled through the room was almost palpable. Elias froze, his carefully constructed composure faltering. His mind raced, grappling with the impossibility of her statement. How could this be? Who was this child, and what connection did she have to his past? The attorneys erupted into a flurry of objections, their voices clamoring to be heard. The bailiff called for order, but Elias barely registered the chaos. His gaze was locked on Maya, who stood rooted in place, her small hands trembling as she clutched the photograph. "Maya," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where did you get this picture?" "It was Mama's," she replied, her words halting but earnest. "She told me to keep it safe. She said it would lead me to you." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. Memories long buried surfaced unbidden. A brief, passionate relationship with a woman named Celeste years ago. They had parted ways amicably, their lives pulling them in different directions, but she had never told him about a child. Could this girl truly be his? The court erupted into chaos once more, but Elias raised his hand, silencing the room. His gaze remained fixed on Maya as he spoke. "This court will adjourn for the day," he announced, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Further proceedings will resume pending additional investigation." He struck his gavel, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. As the courtroom emptied, Elias remained seated, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Maya lingered, her small frame framed by the heavy courtroom doors. She glanced back at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, before disappearing into the corridor with the social worker. Elias sat alone in the silent courtroom, the photograph still clutched in his hand. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt utterly unmoored. This wasn't just a legal case, it was the beginning of a journey that would unravel secrets, challenge everything he thought he knew, and forever alter the course of his life. The shadows of memory. The courthouse was silent as Judge Elias Moreau stood in his chambers, staring out the window. The bustling city seemed oblivious to the storm that had erupted in his life just an hour ago. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, tired, conflicted, and carrying the weight of a revelation he never expected. Maya's words echoed in his mind. "She said it would lead me to you." The photograph lay on his desk, its edges worn and fragile from years of handling. He traced the outline of his younger self, standing beside Celeste, a woman whose name now carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. Her smile in the photo was radiant, full of life and joy. He remembered the laughter they'd shared, the easy way they'd connected. But their relationship had been fleeting, like a summer storm, intense but brief, leaving little trace behind. Or so he thought. Now, a child stood at the center of it all. A child who had called him Daddy. Elias turned to the stack of files on his desk, pushing aside the cases he was supposed to review. He pulled out his personal journal, a leather-bound book he hadn't touched in years. Flipping through its pages, he stopped at an entry dated almost a decade earlier, the last time he'd seen Celeste. July 12, 2015. Celeste came to say goodbye today. I didn't ask her to stay. I knew it would have been selfish. She had dreams as big as mine, maybe bigger. And though we cared for each other deeply, our paths were always meant to diverge. Elias ran his fingers over the faded ink. She hadn't mentioned anything about being pregnant. There had been no hints, no signs that her departure had been anything more than a clean break. He closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spiraling. Who had Celeste become after she'd left? And why hadn't she told him about Maya? His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Evelyn Grant, the social worker assigned to Maya's case. He hesitated before answering. "Judge Moreau," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Your Honor, I'm sorry to bother you," Evelyn began. "But I thought you should know. Maya is asking questions. She wants to know if you're going to keep her." Elias felt a lump rise in his throat. "Keep her," he repeated, his voice soft. "She's worried, Your Honor. She's been through so much, and she's afraid of being sent away again. I think it might help if you spoke with her, gave her some reassurance." Elias pinched the bridge of his nose. "Where is she now?" "She's at the group home for the night. I could arrange a meeting tomorrow if you'd like." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Tomorrow." That night, Elias found it impossible to sleep. He paced the length of his bedroom, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Memories of Celeste flickered through his mind like scenes from an old movie. Their conversations, their laughter, the way she had looked at him with a mix of admiration and challenge. But alongside those memories came a flood of guilt. How had he not known? Was he so consumed with his career, so blind to the signs, that he had missed the most important chapter of his life? He opened his laptop and typed Celeste's name into a search engine. The results were sparse: an old social media profile, an obituary that made his chest tighten. Celeste Daniels, loving mother, friend, and advocate, tragically passed away at 34. His breath caught as he read the brief notice. She had died just 2 years ago. The article didn't mention the cause, only that her death had been unexpected. Elias closed the laptop and pressed his palms against his eyes. The reality of her absence settled over him like a heavy blanket. He wasn't just grappling with the idea of being a father. He was stepping into a void left by a woman who had once meant the world to him. The next morning, Elias arrived at the group home, a modest brick building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Evelyn met him at the entrance, her expression kind but weary. "She's in the art room," she said, leading him down a corridor lined with children's drawings. "It's her favorite place. She says it helps her feel close to her mom." Elias nodded, his steps slow and deliberate. When they reached the room, he paused in the doorway. Maya sat at a small table, her back to him. She was drawing with a set of worn crayons, her movements careful and precise. On the paper was a sketch of a house with 2 stick figures standing in front of it, a tall figure in black and a smaller figure holding hands. Evelyn gave him a reassuring nod before stepping back, leaving them alone. Elias cleared his throat gently, and Maya turned to face him. Her eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and nervous hope. "Hi, Maya," he said, his voice soft. "Hi," she replied, clutching her crayon tightly. "Are you here to take me away?" Her question hit him like a punch to the gut. He crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze. "No, Maya. I'm here to talk, to get to know you." She hesitated, then motioned for him to sit beside her. He lowered himself into the child-sized chair, feeling awkward but determined. "This is you," she said, pointing to the tall figure in her drawing. "And that's me." Elias studied the drawing, his heart aching. "It's beautiful," he said. "You're a very good artist." She smiled shyly. "Mama taught me. She said drawing makes sad things feel less sad." Elias swallowed hard. "Your mama was very smart. I can see a lot of her in you." Maya's smile faded, and she looked down at her hands. "She said you were smart, too. And kind. She said you'd keep me safe." Elias felt tears sting his eyes, but he held them back. "I'll do my best, Maya. I promise." For the first time, she reached out and touched his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. "I'm glad I found you," she whispered. That evening, as Elias drove home, his mind replayed their conversation. Maya's trust, fragile and tentative, felt like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved, but he was determined to earn it. At home, he pulled out his journal again and began to write. August 15, 2024. Maya is my daughter. I see it in her eyes, her smile, even her stubborn determination. Celeste gave me a gift I never knew I wanted, and now it's my responsibility to honor her memory by being the father Maya needs. The road ahead won't be easy. There are questions to answer, wounds to heal. But for the first time in years, I feel a sense of purpose beyond the bench. Maya deserves a home, a family, and a future full of love and stability. Elias closed the journal and placed the photograph beside it. As he turned off the light and climbed into bed, a sense of quiet resolve settled over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them, for Maya, because she was his daughter, and nothing mattered more. Unveiling the threads of truth. The morning was unusually quiet in Judge Elias Moreau's home. The sun spilled through the sheer curtains of his modest study, where he sat surrounded by files, notes, and a growing pile of questions. The photograph of Celeste and himself remained on the desk, a silent witness to the whirlwind his life had become since Maya's revelation. Elias had spent the night poring over the sparse records Evelyn had provided about Maya's time in the foster system. The details were disheartening, 3 placements in 2 years, each home unraveling for different reasons. The last foster family had been flagged for inadequate care, but the details were vague and redacted. Every line seemed to lead to more questions than answers. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about understanding the missing years of Maya's life, and why they'd been obscured. A familiar call for help. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. The screen flashed with a familiar name. Detective Arlo Grayson, a former colleague turned private investigator. Elias had called him the night before, knowing Arlo's knack for digging into murky situations. "Morning, Elias," Arlo greeted, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "Got your message. What's so urgent you're pulling me into the world of family law?" Elias chuckled dryly, though there was little humor in it. "This isn't about family law, Arlo. It's personal." "Personal? You don't do personal," Arlo replied, his tone sharpening. "This must be serious." "It is," Elias admitted, glancing at the photograph again. "I need you to dig into a case, a custody situation involving my daughter." There was a brief pause on the line. "Daughter?" Arlo repeated, his voice tinged with surprise. "You're full of surprises today, aren't you?" "Can you help me?" Elias asked, skipping the explanation for now. "There's something off about her foster records, redacted details, missing documents. It doesn't add up." Arlo's tone grew serious. "Send me what you've got. If there's a story buried in those files, I'll find it." Elias ended the call, a flicker of hope sparking within him. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was Arlo. Piecing together the past. That afternoon, Elias picked Maya up from the group home. She greeted him with a shy smile, clutching her backpack tightly. As they drove, she gazed out the window, her eyes following the passing scenery. He noticed how quiet she was. Observant, cautious, like someone accustomed to blending into the background. "I thought we could go to the park," Elias said, breaking the silence. "I heard there's a great spot for drawing near the lake." Maya turned to him, her eyes lighting up slightly. "Really? Mama used to take me to a park near our old house. She said nature helps you think." Elias smiled. "Your mama was a smart woman." When they arrived at the park, Maya chose a spot beneath a large oak tree, spreading her drawing supplies on the grass. Elias sat nearby, watching her sketch with meticulous care. She was recreating the photograph, his younger self and Celeste, but with a third figure added, a child holding both their hands. As she worked, Elias decided to take a leap. "Maya, can I ask you something about the places you've stayed before?" Her hand paused mid-stroke, and her shoulders stiffened. "The foster homes." He nodded. "Only if you're comfortable. I just want to understand what it was like for you." Maya stared at her drawing for a moment before speaking. "Some of them were okay," she said quietly. "But others, they didn't want me there. They just wanted the money." Elias's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the crayon tightly. "They got money every month for keeping me, but they didn't spend it on me. I wasn't allowed to ask for new clothes or snacks. If I did, they got mad." Elias's heart ached at her words. "Did you tell anyone?" "Mama said not to trust people who pretend to care," Maya replied, her voice trembling. "She said some people only care about themselves." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. "You can trust me, Maya. I'm here for you." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You promise?" "I promise," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. A glimpse of hope. That evening, back at home, Elias received an email from Arlo. The subject line read, "Preliminary findings, foster records." He opened the email, his pulse quickening. Attached was a document summarizing Arlo's initial investigation. The findings were both alarming and revealing. Redacted records, The foster family Maya had stayed with most recently had ties to a private agency under investigation for mismanaging funds. Unusual patterns. The agency placed children in homes with foster parents who had received substantial financial incentives, often without proper background checks. A familiar name. Among the agency's board members was a name Elias recognized, Judge Marion Layton, a former mentor of his who had recently retired under mysterious circumstances. Elias leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Judge Layton had always been a respected figure in the legal community. If he was involved in something this corrupt, it would send shockwaves through the system. The visit. The next morning, Elias decided to confront the past directly. He visited Celeste's childhood home, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Her sister, Angela, still lived there. She answered the door with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Elias," she said, her voice guarded. "It's been a long time." "It has," he agreed, his tone sincere. "I came to talk about Maya and about Celeste." Angela hesitated before inviting him in. The living room was small but cozy, filled with photos of Celeste and Maya at various stages of their lives. Elias's eyes lingered on a framed picture of Celeste holding an infant Maya, her smile radiant despite the exhaustion on her face. "She loved you, you know," Angela said, noticing his gaze. "Even after you two went your separate ways, she always spoke of you fondly." Elias swallowed hard. Why didn't she tell me about Maya? Angela sighed, sinking into an armchair. "Celeste was scared. She thought you had your life figured out, and she didn't want to derail it. But as Maya got older, she realized she'd made a mistake. She started looking for you, but she ran out of time." "What happened?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela hesitated before answering. Celeste had gotten involved with people she shouldn't have. She was trying to protect Maya, but it backfired. After she died, those same people tried to take Maya. That's why she ended up in the system. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "What people?" Angela shook her head. "I don't know their names, but they were powerful. They didn't care about Maya. They cared about control." The revelation. Elias left Angela's house with more questions than answers. As he drove home, his phone buzzed with another message from Arlo. "We need to meet. I found something big." Elias's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he read the words. Whatever Arlo had uncovered, it was bound to complicate things further. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw Maya sitting on the front steps, her drawing supplies scattered around her. She looked up and smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile that made his chest tighten. "Hey, kiddo," he said, stepping out of the car. "What are you working on?" She held up her latest drawing, a house surrounded by flowers, with the words "Home" written at the top. Elias knelt beside her, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We're going to figure all of this out, Maya. Together." For the first time, she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. And for the first time, Elias felt like he was truly stepping into the role of a father, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead to give Maya the life she deserved. Beneath the mask of authority. The next morning was cold and gray, the kind of day that seemed to mirror the unease in Judge Elias Moreau's mind. The discovery of Judge Marion Layton's name connected to Maya's foster care agency added another layer of complexity to the situation. Elias had always admired Layton, a man who had mentored him early in his career. The idea that Layton could be linked to corruption was hard to fathom, but the evidence didn't lie. Elias sat at the dining table, his coffee untouched, as he reviewed the files Arlo had sent the previous night. Beside him, Maya worked on a puzzle, her small hands deftly piecing together the image of a butterfly. The sight of her calm focus grounded him in the moment, reminding him why he couldn't stop digging for the truth. "Did you like puzzles when you were a kid?" Maya asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Elias smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I did. My mom used to buy me the biggest ones she could find. Thousands of pieces, It would take me weeks to finish them. Maya looked up, curiosity shining in her eyes. Did you ever give up? Never, he said firmly. Once I started, I had to see it through. Her gaze lingered on him, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Me too, she said quietly, turning back to her puzzle. Elias watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with pride and determination. Neither of us is giving up, he thought. An unexpected visitor. Later that afternoon, Elias was reviewing court documents when the doorbell rang. Maya, who was drawing at the coffee table, looked up in surprise. I'll get it, Elias said, his tone calm despite the unease creeping into his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find Judge Marion Layton standing on the porch. The older man's imposing figure was as commanding as ever, his gray hair neatly combed, his tailored coat free of even a single wrinkle. But there was something off about his expression, a forced geniality that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marion, Elias said, his voice steady. This is a surprise. May I come in? Layton asked, his tone polite but insistent. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. Of course. Layton's sharp eyes swept the room as he entered, landing briefly on Maya, who had retreated to the corner of the living room. She stared at him with quiet curiosity, her drawing clutched tightly to her chest. Your daughter? Layton asked, his voice laced with fox casualness. Yes, Elias replied. Maya, this is Judge Layton. He's an old friend. Maya nodded but said nothing, her grip on the drawing tightening. Elias motioned for Layton to sit in the armchair opposite the couch. As they both settled into their seats, the atmosphere grew tense, like the calm before a storm. To what do I owe the visit? Elias asked, keeping his tone neutral. Layton leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Elias, I've always respected you, both as a colleague and as a man, which is why I want to offer you some friendly advice. Elias's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. I'm listening. Layton's gaze hardened, his genial mask slipping slightly. This situation with the girl, your daughter, it's messy. The kind of mess that could ruin a career. You've worked hard to build your reputation, and I'd hate to see it tarnished. Elias's stomach turned, but he kept his expression impassive. Are you suggesting I walk away from my own child? I'm suggesting you consider the bigger picture, Layton said, his tone measured. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. Powerful people with deep pockets who don't take kindly to disruption. Elias felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Are you threatening me, Marion? Layton's smile returned, but it was cold and calculating. Of course not. I'm merely offering guidance. Sometimes the best way to protect what you love is to step back. Elias leaned forward, his voice low and firm. Maya is my daughter, and I won't abandon her. If there are forces at play, as you say, then I'll face them head-on. Layton's expression darkened, but he said nothing. He stood, smoothing the front of his coat. I hope you know what you're doing, Elias, for your sake, and hers. As the door closed behind him, Elias felt a wave of relief and determination. If Layton thought intimidation would deter him, he was sorely mistaken. Unearthing the connections. That evening, Elias called Arlo to update him on the encounter. Layton showed up at my house today, he said, pacing the length of his study. He was trying to scare me off. Arlo's tone was sharp. That confirms he's involved. People like him only show their hand when they feel threatened. What's our next move? Elias asked. There's a storage facility on the outskirts of town, Arlo replied. One of my sources says Layton rents a unit there under an alias. If he's hiding anything, it's probably there. Elias hesitated. Is this legal? Arlo snorted. Since when do corrupt judges play by the rules? I'll handle the legal gray areas. You just focus on keeping Maya safe. The storage unit. The following night, Elias met Arlo at the storage facility, a sprawling complex of metal units tucked away behind a chain-link fence. The air was thick with tension as they approached the unit in question. Arlo had a lock-picking kit, his movements swift and practiced. "Let's hope this is worth the risk," Arlo muttered as the lock clicked open. Inside, the unit was packed with boxes and filing cabinets. The air smelled of dust and mildew, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights added an eerie undertone to the scene. They worked quickly, sifting through the contents. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. A series of ledgers, bank statements, and sealed court documents. The evidence painted a damning picture of a network of corruption, with Leighton at the center. Foster families were being paid off to take in children, who were then funneled into illegal adoption schemes or worse. Elias's hands trembled as he held the folder containing Maya's name. The records detailed her placement with the last foster family, including payments made to the agency. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note in the margins. "Keep her close. Leverage for later." "What does that mean?" Elias asked, his voice tight. Arlo's expression was grim. "It means they were planning to use her for something. Leighton wasn't just trying to scare you off. He's trying to cover his tracks." A father's resolve. When Elias returned home, it was well past midnight. He checked on Maya, finding her fast asleep, her small frame curled up beneath a patchwork quilt. Her innocence and vulnerability struck him like a physical blow. He sat beside her bed, his mind racing. He thought of Celeste, her sacrifices, and the love that had driven her to protect Maya at all costs. And he thought of Maya's quiet resilience, her trust in him despite everything she'd endured. Elias leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I won't let them hurt you," he whispered. "Not now, not ever." As he straightened, his resolve solidified. He wasn't just fighting for custody anymore. He was fighting for Maya's safety, her future, and her right to live without fear. The road ahead would be treacherous, but he was ready. Because Maya wasn't just a case or a responsibility. She was his daughter, and he would stop at nothing to protect her. The burden of secrets. The morning broke cold and crisp, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows across Judge Elias Moreau's quiet neighborhood. For the first time in days, he felt an uneasy stillness in the air, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Upstairs, Maya was still asleep, her drawings scattered across her small desk like breadcrumbs leading to the innocence Elias was determined to protect. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. The contents of the storage unit had been damning, proof of a network of corruption and exploitation that stretched further than he had anticipated. But the handwritten note tied to Maya's file haunted him the most. Leverage for later. What had they meant? Why was Maya, out of all the children in the system, deemed so important? His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. It was Arlo. "I've got more," Arlo said without preamble, "and you're not going to like it." Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Tell me." Leighton wasn't just covering for the foster agency, Arlo explained, his voice grim. He's tied to a private adoption network, one that specializes in placing children with wealthy families under questionable circumstances. Maya's name came up in their ledgers, listed as a high-value asset. They weren't just planning to use her as leverage. They were planning to sell her placement to the highest bidder. Elias gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. "That's monstrous." "It gets worse," Arlo continued. "I cross-referenced the ledger with recent custody cases. There's a pattern of children disappearing from the system under Leighton's jurisdiction. He's been doing this for years, Elias. Maya's just the latest victim." Elias closed his eyes, the weight of Arlo's words settling over him like a lead blanket. This wasn't just a custody battle anymore. It was a fight against a system so corrupt, it had turned children into commodities. "What's our next move?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "We need to expose this," Arlo said. "The documents from the storage unit are enough to blow the lid off this operation, but we have to be smart. Leighton's got connections. If we don't handle this carefully, He'll bury the evidence and come after you and Maya. Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we make sure he can't. The crack in the facade. That afternoon, Elias took Maya to the park again. It was one of the few places where she seemed to relax, her guard lowering just enough to let her childlike wonder shine through. As she sat by the lake, sketching a family of ducks, Elias kept watch, his eyes scanning the area for anything, or anyone, out of place. "Do you think ducks stay together forever?" Maya asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on the water. Elias crouched beside her, considering her question. "I think they try to," he said carefully, "but sometimes things happen that pull them apart." Maya looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Like us?" He felt a pang of guilt but forced a smile. "Not like us," he said firmly. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." She smiled back, a small but genuine gesture that made his chest tighten. "Good," she said softly, returning to her drawing. As they walked back to the car, Elias's phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn Grant, the social worker. "We need to talk. Urgent." The warning. Later that evening, Evelyn arrived at Elias's house, her expression anxious. Maya was upstairs, reading one of the fairy tale books Elias had bought for her, leaving them to speak in private. "What's going on?" Elias asked as he poured her a cup of tea. Evelyn hesitated, her hands trembling as she accepted the cup. "I've been reviewing Maya's case history again," she said. "There are irregularities I didn't notice before. Calls from unknown numbers, case notes that don't match the official records. And then there's the agency that placed her with the last foster family. They've been flagged for multiple violations, but no action was ever taken." Elias nodded, his suspicions confirmed. "It's worse than that," he said, explaining what he and Arlo had uncovered about Leighton and the adoption network. Evelyn's face paled as she listened. "My God," she whispered, "this is bigger than I thought." "I need your help," Elias said. "You're inside the system. You can access records, talk to people. If we're going to stop this, we need someone on the inside." Evelyn hesitated, fear flickering across her face. "Elias, if they find out I'm helping you." "They won't," he assured her. "We'll protect you. But I can't do this alone." After a long pause, Evelyn nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll do what I can." The stakeout. That night, Elias and Arlo parked a few blocks away from Judge Leighton's house. The upscale neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where secrets were buried under layers of polished respectability. Leighton's house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, its windows glowing softly in the dark. "He's in there," Arlo said, lowering his binoculars. "And he's not alone." Elias frowned. "Who's with him?" "Hard to say," Arlo replied. "But I'd bet they're part of the network. These people don't leave loose ends, Elias. If Leighton thinks you're a threat, he won't hesitate to come after you." Elias's jaw tightened. Let him try. As they watched, a black SUV pulled up to the house. Two men in suits stepped out, their faces obscured by the shadows. They disappeared inside, the door closing firmly behind them. "This is it," Arlo muttered. "They're circling the wagons." Elias glanced at his watch. "How long do you think we have before they make their next move?" "Not long," Arlo said. "We need to get ahead of them." The turning point. The next morning, Elias met with Evelyn again, this time in a secluded corner of a local cafe. She handed him a flash drive, her hands shaking. "This is everything I could find," she said. "Emails, phone logs, financial records. It's not complete, but it's enough to prove a pattern." Elias nodded, slipping the drive into his pocket. "You've done more than enough, Evelyn. Thank you." As they spoke, his phone buzzed with a text from Arlo. "Meet me at the courthouse. We've got a lead. A father's reckoning." When Elias arrived at the courthouse, Arlo was waiting for him in the parking lot, his expression grim. "They're moving fast," Arlo said, handing Elias a folder. Leighton's trying to have you removed from the bench. He's claiming you've compromised the integrity of your courtroom by involving yourself in this custody case." Elias felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice calm. "Let him try. I won't back down." Arlo smirked. "I didn't think you would. That's why I've got something he won't see coming." He opened the folder, revealing a series of photos and documents connecting Leighton to the adoption network. "We're going public," Arlo said. "Tonight." Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let's do it." The calm before the storm. That evening, as Elias tucked Maya into bed, she looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Elias smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, Maya," he said. "We're going to be okay." But as he sat alone in his study, preparing for the battle ahead, he knew the fight was far from over. Leighton and his network wouldn't go down without a fight, and the road ahead would be dangerous. Still, Elias felt a quiet strength within him, a father's love, fierce and unyielding, that would see him through whatever came next. Justice in the light. The night before the courtroom showdown was restless for Judge Elias Morrow. He sat in his study, the evidence Arlo had collected spread across his desk, like a battlefield map. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the desk lamp casting shadows on the walls. Maya slept upstairs, her room now filled with drawings, books, and the faint beginnings of a life she could call her own. Elias ran a hand over his face, his thoughts heavy. The upcoming hearing was not just about securing custody of Maya. It was about dismantling a system of corruption that had preyed on children like her for years. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the risks were palpable. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Arlo. "Everything's in place. Tomorrow, the truth comes out." Elias stared at the message for a moment before responding. "Let's make sure it does." The courthouse confrontation. The next morning, the courthouse was a hive of activity. The media had caught wind of the hearing, and reporters lined the steps, their cameras and microphones ready to capture the drama. Elias arrived with Maya, keeping a protective hand on her shoulder as they navigated the crowd. "Judge Morrow, do you have any comment on the allegations against you?" One reporter shouted. "Is it true you've compromised the integrity of the bench?" Another asked. Elias ignored the questions, guiding Maya inside. Once they reached the safety of a side room, he knelt to her level. "Stay here with Ms. Evelyn," he said gently. "I'll be just down the hall." Maya nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust. "Promise you'll come back." "I promise," Elias said, squeezing her hand. "I'll always come back." The hearing begins. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with lawyers, journalists, and curious onlookers. At the front of the room, Judge Angela Morrison presided with an air of detached authority. She'd been brought in to oversee the case, a decision that felt more like an ambush than an impartial judgment. Elias took his seat at the defense table, his back straight, his expression calm. Across from him, Marion Leighton sat with his attorneys, his face a mask of smug confidence. The two men locked eyes briefly, a silent battle of wills passing between them. The hearing began with the prosecution presenting their case. They accused Elias of compromising his role as a judge by involving himself personally in Maya's custody. They painted him as reckless, unfit, and blinded by emotion. Elias listened in silence, his hands folded on the table. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, his voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, I did not ask for this case to come before me. I did not seek out this child. But when fate brought her into my courtroom, I had no choice but to act. Maya is not just another case number. She is my daughter, and as her father, I have a duty to protect her." His words hung in the air, a ripple of murmurs passing through the gallery. Judge Morrison's expression remained impassive, but Elias could sense her unease. Then, Arlo entered the courtroom, carrying a large folder. He handed it to Elias, who passed it to the court clerk. "These documents," Elias said, contain evidence of systemic corruption within the foster care system. They implicate Judge Layton and others in a scheme that exploited vulnerable children for financial gain. Maya was one of their targets. Gasps echoed through the room as the clerk began distributing copies of the documents. Judge Morrison's composure cracked for a brief moment before she banged her gavel for order. "This is a serious accusation," she said. "Do you have proof?" "Yes, Your Honor," Elias replied. "I have emails, bank statements, and testimony from individuals within the system. The evidence is irrefutable." The truth exposed. As the evidence was presented, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Arlo took the stand, detailing his investigation into the foster care agency and its ties to Layton. Evelyn followed, recounting her own discoveries and the patterns she had uncovered in Maya's case file. Layton's attorneys scrambled to refute the claims, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. By the end of the day, it was clear that the network's web of deceit was beginning to unravel. Judge Morrison called for a recess, her face pale as she reviewed the damning documents. Elias returned to the side room, where Maya and Evelyn were waiting. "Did we win?" Maya asked, her voice tentative. Elias knelt beside her, a soft smile on his face. "Not yet," he said, "but we're getting there." The final battle. When the court reconvened, Judge Morrison addressed the room. "The evidence presented today is deeply troubling," she began. "It raises questions about the integrity of our legal system and the safety of the children in our care." She turned to Elias. "Judge Morrow, while your actions may have been unconventional, it is clear that they were motivated by a genuine desire to protect your daughter. This court finds no grounds to question your fitness as a parent." Elias exhaled, relief washing over him. However, Morrison's gaze shifted to Layton. "As for you, Judge Layton, the evidence against you is substantial. This court is ordering a full investigation into your actions and those of the agencies involved. You are hereby suspended from all judicial duties pending the outcome of that investigation." The gallery erupted into murmurs, but Elias barely heard them. He turned to Maya, who had entered the courtroom just in time to hear the ruling. Her face lit up with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Does this mean I get to stay with you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias pulled her into a hug, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Maya. It means you're coming home. A new beginning." In the days that followed, the fallout from the hearing made headlines. Layton and his associates faced criminal charges, and a spotlight was shone on the foster care system's failures. The case sparked widespread reform, ensuring better protections for children like Maya. For Elias and Maya, life began to settle into a new normal. Their home was no longer a place of silence and order, but one filled with laughter, art supplies, and the warmth of a growing bond. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Maya handed Elias a new drawing. It showed the two of them standing in front of their house, surrounded by trees and flowers. "What do you think?" she asked. Elias studied the picture, his chest tightening with pride and love. "I think it's perfect," he said. "Just like you." As Maya leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, Elias realized that the battle for her future had not only changed her life, but his as well. In protecting her, he had found a purpose greater than himself, a reminder of what it truly meant to fight for justice, not just in the courtroom but in the world. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. Building bridges. As the legal dust began to settle, Elias found himself navigating the unfamiliar terrain of fatherhood. Maya was adjusting well to her new life, but Elias could see the lingering shadows in her eyes, the quiet caution of a child who had been let down too many times. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Elias decided it was time to start bridging the gaps between them. He knocked on Maya's bedroom door, finding her sitting cross-legged on the floor, organizing her colored pencils. "How about we take a break from all this serious stuff?" Elias suggested, holding up a picnic basket. "There's a park nearby with the biggest oak tree you've ever seen. What do you say?" Maya hesitated, glancing at the basket and then back at her pencils. Finally, she nodded, a shy smile tugging at her lips. Okay. A moment of connection. The park was alive with the sounds of laughter and birdsong. Elias spread out a blanket beneath the sprawling branches of the oak tree, unpacking sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of lemonade. Maya sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched the world around her. "Did you come to parks like this when you were little?" she asked suddenly. Elias nodded. "I did. My mom used to bring me here. She'd pack a picnic just like this one, and we'd spend the whole day climbing trees and skipping rocks in the creek." Maya's eyes lit up. "You climbed trees?" "I did," Elias said with a laugh. "Not very well, though. I fell out of more trees than I can count." Maya giggled, and Elias felt the warmth spread through him. It was the first time he heard her laugh so freely. After they ate, Maya pulled out her sketchpad and began drawing the oak tree. Elias leaned back against the trunk, watching her work. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across her face. For the first time, she looked completely at peace. An unexpected encounter. As they packed up the picnic, a woman approached them, her face familiar. It took Elias a moment to recognize her. Angela Daniels, Celeste's sister. She held a small bouquet of flowers, her expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Angela," Elias said, rising to his feet. "What brings you here?" Angela glanced at Maya, her eyes softening. "I come here every week to leave flowers for Celeste. She loved this park." Maya looked up from her sketchpad, her expression uncertain. "Aunt Angela." Angela's face lit up. "Maya. Oh, sweetheart." She crouched down, opening her arms. Maya hesitated for a moment before stepping into the embrace. Elias watched the reunion, his heart heavy with gratitude. Angela had been one of the few constants in Maya's life after Celeste's death. Seeing her again seemed to lift a weight from Maya's shoulders. As they sat together under the tree, Angela shared stories about Celeste, her love of painting, her fierce determination, and her dreams of giving Maya a better life. "She always talked about you," Angela said, turning to Elias. "Even after all those years, she believed in you. She knew you'd do the right thing when it mattered." Elias felt a lump rise in his throat. "I just wish she'd told me," he said quietly. Angela placed a hand on his arm. "She was scared, but she trusted you, Elias. And now it's up to you to honor that trust." A home filled with hope. As the weeks turned into months, Maya began to thrive. Her once cautious demeanor gave way to a growing confidence, her laughter filling the house that had once felt so empty. Elias, too, found himself transformed. His days were no longer consumed by the rigid routines of the courtroom, but by the simple joys of being a father, helping with homework, cooking macaroni and cheese, and listening to Maya's stories about her day. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Maya turned to him with a serious expression. "Do you think Mama would be proud of me?" she asked. Elias wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Maya, your Mama would be so proud of you. She'd be amazed at how strong and brave you are." Maya rested her head against his chest. "I think she'd be proud of you, too." Elias blinked back tears, his heart swelling with love and determination. "Thank you, sweetheart," he whispered. A father's promise. Despite the progress they had made, Elias knew their journey wasn't over. The investigation into Judge Layton and the corrupt network was still ongoing, and there were days when the weight of the past threatened to resurface. But Elias had found strength in his role as Maya's father, a role that gave him purpose and clarity. One evening, he sat at his desk, writing a letter to Celeste. It was something he'd been meaning to do for weeks, a way to process the emotions that had been building inside him. "Dear Celeste, I don't know if I'll ever have the chance to tell you this, but I need to say it. Thank you. Thank you for bringing Maya into this world, for loving her, and for protecting her when I wasn't there. She's incredible, Celeste. She's smart, kind, and brave. I see so much of you in her, the way she smiles, the way she stands up for herself. I'm trying to be the father she deserves, but I know I have a lot to learn. I miss you. I miss the time we lost, the memories we could have made together. But I promise you this, I will protect Maya with everything I have. I will give her the life you dreamed of for her. And I will make sure your legacy lives on through her. Rest easy, Celeste. I've got her now. Always. Elias. Elias folded the letter and placed it in the box where he kept the photograph of Celeste. As he closed the lid, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Upstairs, Maya called out, "Good night, Daddy." Elias smiled, the sound of her voice filling the house with warmth. "Good night, sweetheart." For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.